Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. Apologies, Alice.
Just from Councillor Turner.
Okay, thanks. So that discussion will be led, I guess, by Nigel Kennedy in particular. Any declarations of interest from panel members? No? Great. Chair's announcement. The only thing really to note, which I think you're well aware of, is there are potentially some confidential items. If we come to them, we have to go into confidential session. So be aware of that in case you're going to comment on those items. And as you're also aware, we're going to have a very busy January wearing a slightly different hat. So be prepared for that. Otherwise, maybe let's go on to the notes. They're not called minutes because we're a panel. Notes of the previous meeting on the 6th of September. Does anyone have any particular comments? Note, by the way, you'll see we did get written responses to the questions since the meeting. Are there any queries, questions on the minutes? I take it that they're approved, so thanks very much. So let's now go on to the work plan. A general comment is when you look at it, the January meeting is fairly full with its agenda, which will come for the lucky members of the panel after the budget meetings. So I think we might want to juggle a bit the agendas between January and March when we get closer to the date, but we don't have to decide now. So in principle, can we agree the work plan and then take a view that we'll review it when we get closer to it? Okay, I take that as assent. So let's go on to the integrated performance report. And I think you all know, but in case you don't, this is going to be Anna's farewell performance. I gather, I only learnt the other day, you've been headhunted by the council closer to your home. So you're going all the way to the Vale. So anyhow, thanks ever so much for all you've done.
Thank you.
Thanks for your dog support as well.
I know they're probably going to make a lot of noise right now as well. Apologies for that. Yes, thank you very much. That's very kind. Thank you, Councillor Fry. This is my last panel. So would you like me to do a brief introduction of the integrated report?
Yes, a brief introduction.
Yeah.
Highlight the main points. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. As always, this is the quarterly report for Q2, so that's to the end of September. This report covers general fund, HRA capital, and some KPIs. The general fund position is an adverse variance of just shy of £500,000. The HRA is showing an adverse, but still a less of a surplus than budgeted for, I guess is the easiest way. And the capital programme, there was a significant amount of slippage. So we had over £20 million worth of slippage in the second quarter of this report. From a performance perspective, we've got 4 indicators. We've got 3 that are red at the moment, and they are mentioned in the report. So I think the biggest area of is around temporary accommodation about this piece, just to increase levels of usage across the city. Well, I think it's a nationwide issue. We are looking to mitigate that and have taken that in through the budget process. You'll see that through the budget papers, and but it is a pressure in the current year. We have got other pressures across different service areas. So we've got some in community services, across a lot of it's to do with utilities, across community services, but we have a corporate contingency set aside to cover those. We do talk about a pressure in corporate property. That's because St Aldate's Chambers hasn't yet been rented out, and also Cadogan House has also been delayed on it and being rented out, so that's no income in this year. again, they've been brought through in the budget papers. And finally, on ODS client, there's that's favourable variance because of a business rate rebate due to the decking being removed. So I'll flick through the report. HRA is, as I said, it's showing a less of a surplus than it originally budgeted for. A lot of that is around the unplanned capital expenditure on responsive repairs and cyclical repairs. But I've got my colleague here, Jason, who will be able to answer any questions on that if we have any. And then just to skip through capital, like I said, £20 million worth of slippage. There's a section there around Cave Street and the work on that being stopped. And then the biggest areas of slippage, we've got East Oxford Community Centre, just delays in the construction. The other biggest areas, I think, are around Blackbird Leys regeneration. The project's ongoing, but there's slippage in expenditure. As we generally see, housing company loans, that fluctuates as we go through the year, but we're slipping some more on that side. That's the Barton Park and the housing company loans. So I think that's a whistle-stop tour of capital. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks ever so much. I know there's one question which is fairly straightforward from Chris already in the chat. I'm going to take the two Chris's first. Well, I'll take Chris Smoten followed by Chris Jarvis. So maybe we'll get 2 or 3 questions and then allow you or Jason to answer, and then we'll take other questions. But Chris Smoten?
Thank you, Chair. As it happened, I had exactly 3 just particular items to ask about. The town hall rates variance. So this is business rates applicable to the town hall. That variance had arisen there. I just wondered what had taken place that caused that. The customer experience change program was described, but I'm not enormously familiar with what that's delivering, actually. I wonder if we could just have a little bit of background as to what's going on there. And finally, on capital spend, if I'm reading this right, it looked like this year we spent 29 mil so far, but are anticipating getting to 137 mil. Which seems like quite a large ratio between spend to date and spend anticipated by end of the presumably financial year. Are we expecting considerable slippage more on top of what we've seen already, or are we actually expecting a lot of very sort of backloaded spending in this financial year?
I guess over to you, Anna. Would you like to respond to those?
Yeah, that's
fine. Town hall rates to begin with.
Town hall rates. I don't know exactly, but I suspect it might be actually in relation to St Aldate's Chambers business rates, because Nigel's nodding. So yeah, so because the building is empty, then we are still responsible for the rates on St Aldate's Chambers, which is a pressure for us because we weren't expecting to, because we expected to have rented it out and therefore to be able to pay for that. Could you repeat your second question, please?
It was about the customer experience, and I think the change, and we weren't quite sure what it refers to.
Is that in the business improvement?
It was Builder's customer experience change program, but I've only got notes to go off, so I'd have to be frantically searching through the document.
Could I take that one, Anna?
Yeah, please, thank you.
Yeah, so effectively, this is the work that's led by Helen Bishop and Tom Hook. It's all in relation to channel shift, so trying to get more, basically get a slicker process for handling our processes around revenues and benefits. Within the budget, we put savings in specifically within the contact center, where we can get automated forms and we can get people to say use those forms, say, to do all that transactional processing. So that's what it's all about, basically. And you'll see in the report that we've had some slippages in the savings on that. We haven't quite got where we need to be, and I suspect we'll push that back till March of this year, where we're going to launch a whole load of forms, basically, and really have a big comms in that area to push that channel shift away from sort of telephone calls into the council onto more self-service. So that's what it's about.
Thank you, Nigel.
Okay, thanks. And the third question, which was about, you
Capital.
start off on capital looking quite low expend. I mean, it's still significant, but
Yeah.
and then it ramps up.
Yes, so obviously we have a ambitious capital program with sort of significant amount of allocated budget at the beginning of the year. We profile this as we go through the year. So because we've got some big construction schemes on there, there's always delays in either starting those schemes or moving through them. As I said, we've had significant slippage this quarter, £20 million. We've got currently a latest budget of just over 150 million, which is obviously still quite a substantial amount. But as far as we do regular robust reviews with the project managers and the accountants. And as far as we are aware at the moment, that is our expected spend up to the end of the year.
Okay, thanks very much. The other Chris Jarvis.
James, and thanks, Anna, for the report. I have a handful of questions. First of which is on housing services and the temporary accommodation costs. Just I guess like a point of information, really. So in the papers, it says that there's a grant received which is currently an earmarked reserve, which could be used to part fund the overspend. I guess the question really is, how much would that part fund the overspend, and what's the implications of using it for that? The second question I had on the temporary accommodation costs was the autumn statement obviously has unfrozen the local housing allowance from April 24, which is obviously in the next financial year. But what impact are we expecting that to have on the amount of exposure we have to temporary accommodation costs? I then have two other questions on other areas which are I guess slightly less specific. So firstly on St Aldate's Chambers, I'm trying to get my head around the impact of the delay in letting, and presumably obviously the delay is having a negative effect in this financial year, but presumably across the MTFS the impact should be neutral, because it's just where the money is landing at which point. So good to get clarification on that. And then finally, this is definitely a more philosophical question, and it was raised I think by other Chris at Scrutiny on Monday. Obviously the news around Cave Street is bad news in terms of that project sort of not coming off, but I wondered, from a slightly more philosophical perspective, whether there's any learnings from the decision making around that about the council being ready to pause projects as and when it's necessary for financial or other reasons, and just to get a sort of assessment of if there's any learnings from that decision making.
Okay.
Thanks very much. So I'm sure others will have questions also about temporary accommodation costs. Do you want to respond, or is that you? Is maybe Jason? I don't know who's the best person.
I am going to call on Jason, if that's all right, on the temporary.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, if that's okay, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. With regards to the use of reserves for the temporary accommodation, we've currently got somewhere in the region of about £900,000 sitting in an earmarked reserve. That will be used to help support the temporary accommodation overspend. Impact going forward of that is that we won't have that money in reserve anymore. We can only use it once. It was there more so for a rainy day. Well, that rainy day is here now. In terms of the LHA rates increasing, that will increase the amount of housing benefit that we will receive towards our cost of temporary accommodation. So that will actually help the situation from the 1st of April next year. Was there anything else on temporary accommodation?
Just quickly on that, do you have a sense of a number on that in terms of how much it will alleviate the pressure?
No, not at the moment. We're just assessing that at the moment.
Thank you, Jason.
Okay.
I'll take the
Next
next one.
SAC, yes.
Yes.
SAC question.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the impact is predominantly in the current financial year. So we're obviously not getting the rental income that we had expected to in the current financial year, so causing a pressure through the MTFP. The rental starts to kick in year one and is leveling out. So it's basically just pushing back a year. So and if it's okay, I will pass Cave Street to Nigel. I'm going to delegate upwards. If that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I think the question was around sort of lessons learned. I mean, this is it's a bit of a difficult project. I mean, that there were sort of significant increases in costs when we got the tenders back initially. The costs were significantly higher than we were anticipating, and I think that's reflected of the financial environment basically, and the just rising costs generally. We subsequently had delays on the project as well, which resulted in basically us losing the grant or the part funding that was coming from Oxlab. They weren't prepared to wait any longer basically for us to get that scheme over the line, so we lost the grant. Combination of those increased costs and the loss of the grant obviously led us to reevaluate the business case. And when we did that, no matter what you did in terms of value engineering to reduce the size of the scheme and sort of adjust the scheme, we really couldn't get the figures to work. So, you know, we took a decision through cabinet to say, in the context of the budget that we are setting, you know, we are in a quite a difficult situation from the budgetary side of things. You know, there isn't a business case really for doing this based on that current project to turn the site into sort of relets for small businesses, etc. And therefore the decision was taken basically to not go ahead with the project. We're subsequently looking at the site now, and for a variety of sort of uses, one of which is potentially TA, so some sort of temporary accommodation and putting units on the site. I think it was felt in terms of the disposal by the property services that now was not the time to dispose of that site. So that was discounted basically. And to say we are now looking to see whether we can use it for temporary accommodation. In terms of lessons learned, well, I think not sure what there would be, but certainly I think bold enough to sort of say, look, we just can't get this to work, and there's no point in flogging a dead horse. In the context of the budgetary pressures that we've got, you cannot possibly carry on and spending what be another 1.2 million basically in borrowing costs, etc., to fund this. It's not going to work, and we need to think of another use for it. So we were bold enough to do that. We put that forward to office to members, and that was agreed, sort of thing. So you know, I'd say I think it would be down to the project managers to lessons learned. But from my point of view, you know, the fact that we revisited the business case, say in the context of the budget, I think was the right thing to do, really.
Okay, thanks very much. First Amir, then Hosnier. So I'll take Amir first. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I'm trying to work off two screens, so if it looks like I'm distracted, that's the reason why. Just wanted to check, thanks for the report, Anna. Just on the general fund, it's saying that there's an adverse variance of about £500,000, but that this would be offset by £4 million from ODS if the dividend payment came through. And I just wanted to understand what level of confidence we have that that payment might come through. I couldn't quite see it detailed in the report. Thank you.
Yeah, so the £4 million dividend from ODS has been agreed in principle and is being ratified at their board next week. So we are reasonably confident that we will actually get the payment through in this financial year. You've moved on my screen. I feel like I'm not looking at you. Not that you would know.
Thank you in any case.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it? Was there only one question?
I did only have one question.
Oh, okay. You're very efficient. Yeah.
So thank you. So on the temporary accommodation, I looked at the numbers, which said you may not have the answer to this actually, because I know Neris is not here. Essentially, they were looking at about 20 people in temporary accommodation on the report, And actually, I think having been speaking quite a lot to Asylum Welcome and the medics who look after the asylum seekers at the CASAM, those numbers, we actually got a breakdown of the numbers up until May this year. So it was around 18, 19, and then in May it was around the 30 mark. And actually, we've already had quite a lot of asylum seekers who've been given their refugee status, and I actually ending up on the street. So, and I know Neris and others are aware of this, and Stephen Cohen and are doing some work on that. But I just wonder whether those numbers really are that realistic, because that temporary accommodation cost might actually increase quite significantly if, as it's happening at the moment, the refugee statuses will come through. So we've already had about 10 people, I think, who've recently had their refugee status accepted. And they're not going to necessarily move on from Oxford because we have services here, which are, I understand people want to be where the services are. So I just wondered what the risk was to the council from that point of view. And then secondly, on leisure services, are we looking at things as they are before? Obviously, I know there's a tender process ongoing. How does that affect the deficit that we're talking about within the leisure service running? Because obviously that's just ongoing running costs rather than any changes to the contract and what comes after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
You want to answer that, Anna?
From a temporary accommodation situation, I'm not aware. Nigel, are you able to pick that one up?
Yeah, I think just suffice to say you're absolutely right in your observation. I mean, TA is being badged as a tier 2 authority, a district council's version of adult social services for tier 1 authorities. There are councils such as Hastings issuing section 114 notices because they cannot deal with the amount of temporary accommodation costs. We put a sort of conservative amount there, what we think is going to cost us for this year, and that's already at $750,000. I think, although the figures have probably changed recently, at one point we had something like 75 families in hotel accommodation, and then obviously more in temporary accommodation on top of that as well. I think it's fair to say that there's a project mobilized on this basically to try and mitigate those costs through a variety of different uses of different buildings and the like, and also bring in more sort of PSL, private sector leasing, to mitigate. But you're absolutely right in your observation. It is a big problem for the city council, and one where we've got significant number of resources trying to mitigate as much as we possibly can. Actually,
so could I just come back? When you say mitigate, how can we mitigate it?
Well, obviously putting people in hotels basically is costing us a fortune, something like over £1,000 a week. So what I'm saying, mitigate, if we can move people to PSL, that will mitigate some of the costs. There's potential use of the buildings such as O'Hanlon House, for instance. So it's those sorts of mitigations I'm talking about, James, actually,
okay,
which should reduce our costs.
Thank you. And the other question, I don't know who will answer on the leisure contract.
So,
No, you can't go on now.
No, I was just going to say, so from a leisure services perspective, the report that's in front of you is around the current financial year. And so the pressures that we've got around leisure services are partly to do with utilities and the contract we have with Fusion. So going forward, the tender process is taking into account the experiences that we've had, I guess, over the contract, so that we are making sure that the contract negotiations will account for those potential risks.
Thank you. So are there any more from the panel? Because I have a few questions. Maybe I will fire off. That's okay. I'm going to look. It's very hard. I mean, I'm not quite like Amir with 2 screens, but having switched to my Word document, I mean, I'm first going to make just what I think is a rhetorical comment. I get the sense every time we come back to these, and SAC epitomizes this, I think there is sadly an optimism bias always present in the corporate property estimates. I mean, it is worrying that things like SAC have slipped and slipped, but we know there is optimism bias, which we've all just heard about in the capital expenditure. More specific things. Stanningford House and the Cave Street I don't know how important the Oxley funding was in the overall assessment of that as a project. I mean, if it was important, is it retrievable? Maybe I'll ask that just as a first direct question. Is there an easy answer?
No, there is an easy answer. The answer is no, James. That ship has sailed, unfortunately. It was one, but in the report it says 1.13 million was the grant against a 9.7 million pound capital program, and that ship has sailed, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. In terms of slippage, specific things that seemed a bit odd where somehow things hadn't been anticipated. In car park income, we note that there's the delay in starting to charge for both Godstow Road and Florence Park car parks due to changes needed in parking orders. Why weren't the orders anticipated? And somewhat, it seems the sort of thing people would have known about. Another thing, which again involves the county, on the Gulo on-street scheme, there's a slippage of £500,000, which is because of the back-to-back legal agreement not having been agreed as quickly as it should with the county. Is there a problem in getting, is it from our side? Is it from the county side? I'm sure you're going to say county, but still, where does it lie?
Unless Anna knows, I'll say
No.
county basically. But to be fair, James, I don't know actually. I think it's fair to say there's been quite a backlog of work to tackle within law and governance. Basically, I think we've trailered before about the significant numbers of vacancies that they were running with in law and governance, and there has been a backlog of work. And I think that knocks on to the car parking issues that you raised as well. There was more work than we anticipated in terms of the parking orders, basically, to get these two car parks over the line. I'm reliably informed that they should be operational because there's also a delay for consultation as well of about, I think it's about 25 days. I'm reliably informed that they should go operational from the new year, basically. I think it's just around backlogs of work, really.
I mean, I feel it's a kind of optimism bias about getting things over the line, quite apart from maybe delays from the county. If I could just ask a last question, then I'll go back to Chris Smoten. We know all about the wrong letters going out about the single person discount. And clearly that's had a big impact on the contact centres, and we come to their performance later. But has that problem now been resolved forever? Is something happening to ensure that we don't get a silly error like that again?
I would like to say yes, James. I suppose put my neck on the block to say it would never happen again. Basically, that was a system error. Basically, we were quickly onto it and rectified.
Okay, I think you've frozen, at least on my screen. But I think I take your point that you hope it's resolved. I'm going to go Smoten. He has his hand up.
I might need to wait for Nigel to revive.
I think he did imply that he thinks this has been resolved, but maybe he should listen to the exciting discussion.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll ask the question anyway. See who wants to respond. So it was just a particular thing with respect to the optimism about what we're going to get done. Is I noted in particular in the capital budget report of spend up till the 31st of September, IT had in particular a lot of projects with reasonably chunky budgets and zero spend to that date. So, for example, iTrent replacement was at zero, asset management system budget of 300 grand, no spend yet, scanning of all paper files, 150 grand, no spend yet, etc., etc. There's a long list of IT projects, and only The housing management system, which is named in this report, but I understand we're probably not supposed to, is the only one that's moved significantly from zero, and there's very small amounts to spend on a couple of other things. So again, really just wanting to challenge, are we being too optimistic as to what IT is going to be able to get done with the people they've got and the time they've got?
Hello, welcome back, Nigel. Do you
Yeah.
want to answer to Anna or even Bill?
I didn't hear the question. Actually,
Did you hear the
It
question?
was about
It-
IT optimism, you know, that you've got lots of spending on IT, which hasn't yet started.
There's schemes with budget with no spend. I think like you said, there's the iTrent replacement, which we know. I think the intention is we'll do some upgrades and spend on the system, but we won't be replacing it at the moment. I think it probably is fair to say that there is a little bit more robustness needed on the ICT schemes around slippage, which we'll make sure we've done for quarter 3.
Do you want to add anything, Nigel? That was the gist of the question about the slippage. And
no, again, and I sound like I'm making excuses, but again, there are staffing issues within ICT and the ability to get some of these projects over the line. They're not all to do with staffing. I mean, you know, and in terms of the iTrent system, it was felt after a review to extend the current system and not move it from its current platform. So that was a decision that was taken basically. So that's one of the reasons why that's not gone forward. We're all aware of some of the issues around QL basically. Won't go over those, but I think there's a mixture of reasons basically, but some of it is undoubtedly staffing and having the staff resources to actually undertake the projects.
okay, I think we probably have spent enough time on this. It's an important item. In terms of recommendations, some of it is just bits of clarification, like the earmark reserves that were mentioned for temporary accommodation. I'm sure this will be a feature in the budget discussions next week. I mean, the thing about temporary accommodation generally and asylum seekers, and you gave an ideal answer, Nigel, maybe would a recommendation be that we need some clarity on what the options really are for reducing these temporary accommodation costs? Because in theory they're there, but it would be nice to have some genuine sense as to what the reality is. Is it possible to request that as a, you know, as a recommendation?
You can do, James. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other points that we need?
I think Hosni wants to come in, James.
Yes, Hosni.
Just on that point, sorry, I know I'm going to take it away from the conversations that are around the budget and kind of a bit of real life stuff in it. The issue in my mind is that if we don't have enough in reserve and we are making conservative estimates about how many numbers we will end up with, at the moment, actually, most people who are ending up on the street actually haven't applied, haven't gone through the housing register yet, because they are now going through the homelessness processes. So, but our city, compared to lots of other cities, is in a much better position to actually give accommodation and sanctuary to some of these asylum seekers. So I would be really hesitant, and I think it would be real negative if we ended up effectively by not being able to provide the accommodation because we haven't looked at the reserve enough, actually driving people away from Oxford. Whereas actually, I think compared to lots of other places, we have a lot more services. You know, there's a lot more volunteer sector organizations, especially, that do a lot of this work day in, day out, and actually in a much less hostile place. That's the other good thing about our city. So I do think that, though I understand how I can see from the conversation how the calculations are done, I actually think if we're on the conservative side, it does have impact on how officers then manage the situation. And I dislike, you know, I think it would be a real disservice to all of us in our city if we were to do it in a conservative way, if you see what I mean, because we're having to reduce the amount of costs in hotels.
I don't know. Do you want, Jason, Nigel, would you like to respond? I mean, I'm not quite sure how it relates really. I mean, don't we have a statutory duty? I don't know
Yeah.
that we can push people away. I think this is one of the difficulties of planning, that we've got to do it whether we like it or not, pretty much. I don't know.
Not quite, because if people after a while are being basically homeless, they can choose to go anywhere, because once they've got refugee status, though they might not move on, or if they're in O'Hanlon House for a while and things are really bad, they will be, so I think, yes, I see what you mean, James, but I just think that being on the conservative with the numbers and not forward planning enough on this issue will be to a detriment. But Nigel, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think it's a case of we will clearly do as much as we possibly can to support people that are homeless, and in the constraints of the budget. As I say, we're already forecasting an overspend this year of £750,000. We've included another £300,000. That's a net figure. So that's after all housing benefit we've claimed back, basically. The figures are running into millions, basically, that we are spending on homelessness, actually. So we will do all that we can in the context of the financial resources that we've got available. It is a key area for the city council, basically, around housing. But I do stress that some other authorities, like the likes of Hastings, that is a reason why they are declaring effectively bankruptcy, because they simply can't afford to deal with all those costs, basically. I wouldn't want us to get into that situation, but we will do as much as we can. We will use as much reserve as we can, basically. These are earmarked reserves specifically for homelessness as opposed to any other purpose, so they will be used. But there will come a point that you've either got to sort of try and curtail that, or something else has got to give in terms of council priorities. And I guess that's for members to decide where they want those other cuts and reductions to happen, if they want to put more and more into homelessness, actually.
I was going to suggest that in terms of procedure, these are exactly the sort of questions, Hosnia, you should be drafting for the budget panel meetings, because I'm sure this will be a mega item when we come to that. But it's, if you like, we're looking a little bit at just this financial year where there are earmarked reserves. The problem will hit us over the next 4 years, I fear. But please pose some questions, and I'm sure that'll be a good discussion. Are there any other points? Did you have anything, Alice? You've been there assiduously taking notes. Are there any things that struck you as a recommendation? I think they're largely discussion rather than clarification.
Yeah, I think most of the questions I've got down as largely answered. I've only got the potential recommendation suggested around the clarity on options for reducing TA costs. That's the only recommendation that I've got.
If we really wanted to, we could put something in there about assessing the IT capital program.
Well, it's true of all the capital programs. They all are starting off at a very low pace. I mean, I feel this is a kind of optimism bias, but I think it's a structural problem in doing these things. Do we want to say something about, we are concerned about signs of optimism bias, even on the commercial property front? I don't know. IT, commercial property, they're both areas that are very clear, but capital generally. Is that okay? I feel maybe the time has come to say to Anna, much as we would love you to stay on the call, if you want to go, I think now you can bid us a fond farewell.
If it's okay, I am going to stay, because
Great.
Yeah.
I hope you
quietly.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's then proceed. Thanks ever so much. And let's go to the Treasury Management Report. I think Bill and Paul are going to be a double act on this. So who's going to speak first? Is it you, Bill?
Yes, I think Paul's more here because this is his first meeting, so he'll be here to observe rather than speak, although depending on the questions, I might actually drop him in it.
Okay. And by the way, remember this we do have a confidential item if anyone wants to discuss it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So a brief introduction. So this report summarises background to Treasury management and reasons for producing the report in paragraphs 1 to 5. Also says about the overall Treasury management investment and borrowing activity, which is forecast to be beneficial at slightly over £1 million compared to the budget. There's more detail on that in paragraph 12. The report also provides an economic and market overview and the detail of that investment portfolio performance in paragraphs 6 to 21. Then there's a section on the council's long-term fund investments in paragraphs 22 to 37. And then paragraph 45 just identifies that the council hasn't had to take out any new long-term borrowing to support the capital programme as of yet. But it is likely that the council will need to do that in the near future. So I think importantly from a governance perspective, the kind of key message is that the Treasury management activity has been managed within the confines of what was agreed in the Treasury management strategy back in February. So there haven't been any diversions from that, for which we need to report. So if I can hand over to questions now, please.
That's nice and succinct. Thanks a lot. Are there, Amir, you the first to put your hand up.
Thanks, James. I think that my questions relate to the appendices or certainly matters relating to the appendices. So I understand they're confidential. Yeah. So I don't know whether you want to take questions from others if it doesn't relate to the appendices, and then we can go into closed session after that, maybe.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that if we're going into confidential, rather than the hassle of going on and off for the recording, maybe we should take them at the end. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions, Amir?
No, they're all relate to the the confidential appendices.
Right. Thanks very much. Chris Smoten.
Thank you. So I do have a question relating to investments, but it's more abstract. It doesn't get into the particulars. Okay. It's about what is the actual impact of when the absolute value of an investment the value of the principal is falling, but the rate of return is steady. I'm assuming that what's happening there is that, for example, if a principal is worth 20% less than it was when it was bought, but it's still yielding you sort of 4% a year or whatever, then you're getting that 4% is being calculated against the principal each year, and therefore the cash income you're receiving from that is also down 20%. If that reading is accurate, what impact does that actually have on the council? Like cash-wise, we've actually received a decent, not a huge chunk, but a chunk less than we would have done. But that obviously doesn't materialize on our revenue budget, that's kind of the question, I suppose. Where does it materialize? What impact does it have when our investments are yielding less in cash terms?
Bill.
Yeah. Okay. So I think probably what we're referring to are the pooled funds here, because they're the only ones where the principal element is affected by revaluations. When we calculate percentage returns, we calculate that on the original investment rather than the revised value. So, if the percentage is staying constant, it's still a constant amount that's going into the revenue budget. As far as the actual effect of the fall in capital values, there is a a statutory override at the moment that's in operation until the end of March 2025. At that point, when the statutory override cuts out, there's a different regime. Now at the moment, what we have from an accounting perspective, we put in any losses into the revenue account and then take it out again. So that's what the statutory override does, is that taking out part. So hence, the capital changes don't currently affect the revenue monitoring or revenue budgets. Come 2025, which will be in the financial year 25-26, we will have to actually reflect the changes in the capital value of fund assets actually in the revenue, and there won't be a reversal out unless the government decides that it's going to extend that statutory override, which, given what they've said, is believed in the local authority kind of professionals as being very unlikely that they'll extend it. So yes, at that point, there will be an impact if there's a loss on capital, but there's also an impact if there's a gain on the capital side to the revenue budget. So it's important to say at the moment that we do have an earmark reserve that's held against the risks of loss on the property funds and the multi-asset funds. So that's currently just sitting there, and it's recognizing that there is a risk of loss. The important thing to note on all of these, though, is that they are long-term investments. And so at the moment, as everybody knows, we're going through quite a difficult economic position. So it's sort of likely to be the low point of funds like this. And therefore, as we probably say in every report, these are long-term investments, and so capital values do go up and down over time.
Is that accounting rules bit? Is that where in paragraph 23 it mentions a statutory override that came in 2018 for 5 years? Has that actually been extended again since the report was written and will actually run till 25?
Not since the report was written. I obviously missed actually putting something in about it being extended out for a further 2 years. So that's my fault. I should have added that in.
Okay.
Sorry, on this, maybe I could, I was wondering about the 5 years, but are you allowed, since there are different investments, and you said some you may gain, some you may make losses, are they just treated in aggregate? Because that would be the easiest thing to do. Is that how it will be presented, or they will be done individually where you will be hauled over the coals if you're making losses?
Right. Well, effectively, they're dealt with in aggregate, but we would actually account for them individually, but the impact on the revenue will be the aggregate position.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the panel? I have just one, which is maybe ultimately related to this sort of issue in the risk profile. I just wonder, and I would maybe even suggest as a recommendation not to discuss now, it's explained that we agreed back in the past that a maximum of 25% or 25 million would be invested in non-specified funds. And I'm not sure anyone is on the call who was among the councillors who was there when, I recall, in this same panel, one of our number was pushing hard for us to increase the limit. I think it would be good at some point to have a background note now in the light of experience about whether that's the right limit, whether it might be reviewed. That was what I was going to suggest, if that's acceptable to the panel, because the experience now is illustrating some of the risk of doing this percentage, this approach. I don't know, is that acceptable? Okay, I mean, it's not terribly exciting recommendation, but at least it relates to this. If not, that's great. Let's then move on to the budget, which I think is, we're going to have a lot of meetings. I'm going to invite Nigel just to say some introductory words, but you gather the suggestion is that we should be submitting questions up until Alice has negotiated up until Monday early about specific aspects where we could look at temporary accommodation, all these issues in the light of the budget papers. So I'm going to suggest that Nigel makes an introduction now, but we leave discussion until we come to the budget meetings, if that's okay. So over to you, Nigel.
Okay. Thanks, James. So yeah, just by way of brief introduction, again, another particularly difficult budget round, actually, where we've had to try and pull the figures together. But we have got to a point where we're able to present a 4-year or indeed a 5-year balanced budget, basically. And I think, there are many authorities in the country that would give their left teeth basically to be in that position. We are few and far between of being able to do that at a time when a lot of local authorities, and we'll hear about a bit more in a bit more detail later on in the meeting, are issuing Section 114 notices declaring bankruptcy. So I think that's the first highlight of this particular budget. That having been said, it's against the backdrop of utility bills, rising utility bills. There's an extra 1.2 million being included in the budget, and we're already experiencing some of that in the current financial year. We talked about homelessness, and homelessness costs are going upwards, and indeed our wholly owned companies are finding the financial climate very difficult, resulting in £2 million worth of reduction in dividend from OX Place that we had to contend with, and also £1 million a year reduction in the dividend from ODS as well, actually, on top of that. So, over the next 4 years, a £6 million reduction in income coming back from our wholly owned companies. We've had increasing costs on our capital program as well. We talked about borrowing rates rising and staying and remaining at just over 5%. And inflation, although coming downwards, is still at relatively high levels. And again, that affects our capital program, our borrowing, and obviously interest costs as well. So a very, very difficult backdrop to contend with. We've had the autumn statements published on the 22nd of November. Didn't really give us any surprises. Things that we had been expecting are already included in the budget. The recent policy statement, which has been issued, I think it was today or yesterday, basically, from the government, again, just firms up some of the things they said in the autumn statement. So, for instance, they confirmed the referendum level at 3% for districts or £5, whichever is the higher. They've confirmed the extension of the retail, hospitality, leisure discount for small, medium-sized businesses for another year. And also the multiplier basically has been frozen for some of those businesses as well, basically. So the autumn statement didn't really give us much, basically more than we're expecting. And for an authority of our size, and it doesn't really cope with some of the additional pressures that we've got running through the budget. Some of those ones are around, things I just mentioned, but also in addition to that, cost of living pressures around the pay bill, for instance, which has been a real difficult one to deal with, although we have recently come to what we believe is an agreed position, which is being balloted on. So I'd hope that position holds true, actually. But again, that's a significant increase in costs for the city council, like any other council in the country. We've had to make some really difficult decisions. We set a stall out for setting the budget, a strategy, which said we're going to look at more efficiencies, see what more we can do. We'll look at fees and charges, and we're going to have to put up some of our fees and charges for car parking, garden waste, and the like. we will also look at, or I will look at, how much more reserves I can use. And there's only so much you can do with reserves. They're one-off. I'm looking to use about another just over £7 million over the next 5-year period, but we can use no more in the current climate. Basically, that is it. Basically, if we use any more than that, then our financial stability basically will be in some jeopardy, given the risks that we are actually running. So there is no more to be used from reserves basically over that period. We've had to make or proposed by officers and accepted by members some difficult decisions. We've had to reduce areas like grass cutting and street cleansing, and those are in the first year of the budget. Actually, we've had to take some of those decisions, and recommendations in the budget report are for making reductions in those areas. And in the second year, there's even more what I would term difficult decisions around community services. Over £600,000 worth of reductions in community services and voluntary sector grants, and also having to look at the costs and the services provided by ODS. So I'm not just talking about dividends, which are primarily delivered back to the council in the form achieved from efficiencies. I'm talking about service reductions, basically, for services that are provided by ODS. So waste, recycling, building works, all those sorts of services, basically really having a look at those and saying, can we afford to do all of that? And there are significant reductions in service costs over the next 5-year period. So, as I say, the highlight is that we have a balanced budget. I suppose a low light from a service point of view is that we're having to propose some of those service reductions, which are not really welcome. But it is a sign of the times. And as I say, you'll see in a minute, and I'll talk about Section 114s, and those difficult decisions that are having to be made will, for I would say the foreseeable future, prevent us having to issue a Section 114 report, which is being issued by quite a considerable number of authorities over the months. And indeed, a considerable number of authorities are stating that they will be issuing those reports in the not too distant future. I think it's 90% of county councils are saying that could be the case, and include districts and counties. It's one in 5 basically saying they will be issuing those reports in the coming years. So that's where we're on the general fund. In terms of capital, I'll just say on capital, again, we have a sizable capital programme over the 5-year period, about £1 billion of expenditure, which is eye-watering indeed for an authority of this size. Actually, we have tried to trim that back, and indeed initial bids from officers were trimmed back basically because from an affordability angle, they just weren't affordable basically. And we've now got a program which is affordable. We've included what we call optimism bias. You'll hear James talk about optimism bias, which is a term recognised by HM Treasury, which is basically people putting in things that they're over delivering on when they don't really have any chance of delivering. So in terms of our capital program, you'll see in the budget papers a reduction of 40% on the initial starting point of budget bids that have been put forward by officers and project managers, on the basis that you will not deliver on all of that. And we estimate, or it's a judgment call, but I suppose I estimate that you won't deliver on 40% of the program that you're telling me you're going to be doing. And then finally, in terms of the HRA has always been the sort of poor cousin of I've always felt of the council, because it ran itself. It was never really troubled by reductions and savings and the like, actually. But I think the times are changing in terms of the HRA. We've got new requirements from the regulator under the White Housing White Paper, which has meant that we've had to employ another 10 or so staff basically in housing alone on the HRA to deal with the requirements of the regulator. We have decent homes and new requirements from decent homes, which we still haven't quite got clarity on. We've got the carbon retrofit basically program and the council's own policy statement that we will be carbon neutral in terms of our council dwellings by 2040. And all of those basically are driving us to a conclusion following a review, an external review that we commissioned with some set of consultants, which is indicating that unless we get some government help basically and some government funding for things around the retrofit program, we will not be able to fund all of the housing requirements basically, and we will basically be running the HRA into the ground by 2030. So again, something has got to give. Now, we've only recently had the consultants report. There's a lot of work to do basically in the HRA, and the current what's been presented in the budget basically for the HRA is a bit of a holding pattern to say this is what we can afford. We are aware that that probably is not enough in the absence of more government funding. It includes a 7.7% rent increase, which we believe will be the cap introduced by the government of CPI plus 1%, although that has not been confirmed yet, actually. But we still not, it will not show basically a position of affordability because there are other costs basically which we haven't included because we've effectively cut our costs accordingly. I believe in the next coming months, basically, we will be bringing further reports back to members around specifically around the HRA about what we're going to do in order to try and put the HRA in a more sustainable position. But for the first time in many years, the HRA is under considerable pressure, basically. And I would say we are one of the better authorities in this space. We are deemed by DLUHC as an exemplary authority. And if we can't make it work, then nobody can make it work. And that's not just rhetoric; that is a fact. So yeah, that's the budget. There are some good things in there, but I say there's some really difficult areas as well, actually. But happy to take questions on any of that.
Well, thank you for what clearly isn't a terribly happy backdrop to the 4-year budget. Could I just, before I'll take Chris, but just before that, I thought that in the autumn statement there was some slightly helpful news about the increase in housing benefit. Is that true?
To be fair, James, I haven't tracked that element. I think you're probably right. And I think that more affects the customers sort of thing. I'm not aware of any significant effect on the city council and the finances actually.
Okay.
But yeah, perhaps I just haven't clocked it actually.
Okay. And I'm going to remind people, I can see, I'll take the questions and the hands, but of course, proper questions should be drafted, sent via Alice, so that we can have a proper, more detailed discussion when we come to the budget panel. But Chris Smoten, Chris Jarvis, then Amir. Chris Smoten?
Yeah, thank you. I won't get into depth on the questions I've already sent through. I just wanted to ask about, there were some particular categories of general fund expenditure where what I'd done was set the MTFS from last year side by side with so the year 2 of the MTFS as we saw it a year ago, next to year 1 of the budget as we see it now, and then just set those side by side. And just wanted to ask if you could briefly comment on a couple of those that had changed remarkably. So there's all the columns under business improvement have reasonably large variances. When you look at things like ICT, for example, there, where it was anticipated to be 254k in profit and is actually still costing us 133k. Is that the revenue side of the capital slippage that we were seeing in the previous report? Is that a case of we were hoping to get these revenue benefits out of the capital spending, but the capital spending has slipped and therefore so has the revenue benefit? Community services seem to make sense. That seemed to be like, leisure's up 6%, community centres are up 10%. Presumably that sort of smells a lot like utility costs. There's localities in there. I don't actually understand at all what localities accounts for. If you could say briefly what activity comes under the localities budget, that'd be useful. And finally, corporate services was a little bit surprising. Corporate services had gone up by 910K compared to the previous year's NTFS, which is about 20%. Most of that was financial services. So unfortunately, we have the boss of financial services present. And some of those slightly, like for example, accountancy was anticipated to be minus 109 and is actually plus 153. So because I wouldn't normally think of accountancy as making money, is that something which normally is being like recharged within the organization? And that's just a case of we were hoping to make savings on the running costs, but we weren't able to do so within this calendar year, or is that something completely different?
Okay, thanks. So I guess I will ask you, Nigel, to respond. I mean, it's an interesting comparing last year's estimate with the latest year one estimate. There was one about business improvement, capital investment slippage. I mean, what's the reason for it going down?
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of the. I think there's a combination of things actually. We've had rising costs in terms of our data storage costs, basically, which has obviously increased the net cost, basically. We are trying to mitigate that in terms of moving systems to the cloud. Basically, if you can move a system to the cloud, then you reduce your storage cost quite considerably. So we've had slippages on that program, and obviously QL basically was a system we were going to move to the cloud, but unfortunately the supplier has since said they haven't got a cloud-based system, so we're having to look at different things. So there are slippages in the capital program are leading to increased cost, but they also lead to savings that we can't realize. So for instance, some of the areas around Aggresso, for instance, where we've had delays in trying to move Aggresso to the cloud, we've had to incur additional costs in running that, and hence the savings that we predicated initially are not being achieved. So I think a combination of both increased costs and reduced savings basically has led to overall increased costs in ICT. In terms of localities is a term which is used to identify staff that are based, funnily enough, within localities. So within the states around the city, we have a cohort of staff basically that deal with trying to coordinate both the state management basically, and also trying to head off problems at the past basically. So head off problems around people getting in arrears with their council tax or indeed their housing rent, and trying to work with them basically in a prevention way basically, rather than waiting for the arrear to build up and then we try and ultimately try and help them at a point where it's got too far basically. So localities is about trying to put the service back down at the sort of grassroots level basically. There is an element of HRA expenditure there, which we charge the HRA, but I would imagine that what you're looking at is the general fund side of things actually, which is appropriately charged there. We've only recently, I'll say in the last 18 months, set that up basically. And I think it's in a bit of a pilot mode to see how that's working. Is it doing what we need to do basically, or have we got to change the tune again? And I suppose it goes back to an earlier question about customer service and trying to increase the customer experience around that particular area actually. In terms of the corporate services, I mean, you're probably talking about financial services, law and governance, you were talking about chief executive and all the support services. And I must admit, I haven't got all those figures in my head, and it might be one to pick at the budget review group, but a sample of things, for instance, I know on the legal side, basically, we had a significant increase in the pay for lawyers. You may recall conversations we had where we had somewhere like 9 vacancies in terms of lawyers, and we just couldn't appoint lawyers for Love Nor Money. We put £15,000 on each post as a market supplement on each of those posts, and indeed paid more to existing lawyers to retain their services. So that's one big area where there's been a significant increase. Other areas off the top of my head, certainly in finance, we've had a significant increase in valuations. You may recall that we had a unfortunate death of one of our colleagues in the property team, which meant that we had to put all our valuations of property for both the companies or the housing company, housing, and also all our other properties out to valuation firm. That's been a significant additional cost, and I think it's well over £150,000 increase basically in terms of doing that. And I don't think that's gonna go down anytime soon. And indeed, that is something that's running through the budget now, actually. So, I mean, in those two things alone, you're looking at the best part of sort of 200,000 to 300,000, actually. So, like I say, we're covering all the services here. So perhaps I pick up a bit more detail on that, Chris, in the budget review group, actually. But those two items alone are a significant chunk of that increase that you refer to.
That's a very good and full answer. Thanks very much. But again, as you said, this is where the budget review will field the questions in more detail. I see the other Chris Jarvis, you say you've got a couple of process questions and so on. Please fire ahead.
Sure, yeah. I guess it's less of a question and more of a request moving forward in budget review group. Having gone through this process twice now, I feel like one of the things that we've come up against in budget review group is when we've asked questions which relate to sort of modelling, particularly around fees and charges. The responses that we've had back haven't sort of detailed what the underlying assumptions are behind that modelling. And that's made it quite challenging, I think, for us to meaningfully interrogate some of the figures, particularly around. I mean, the example from last year is the questions we put in around car park income and park and ride and so on. And given that it inevitably, I mean, at least for the 2 years that I've been on finance panel, that's been an area we have a particular interest in looking at. I think it'd be really useful, I think, if we could request that we get those underlying assumptions so we can stress test them and as a panel. And so it was just a request, really. And then I guess the second thing is just a process question, which I guess either Alice or Nigel might be able to answer. Is just around, in terms of, we've got the deadline for when we're putting questions in for, just in terms of planning our festive period and what time we give we put aside for looking at this. It'd be good to know, and I may have missed it written down somewhere, when we can expect responses back, just so that we can plan in preparation for that intense January time.
Alice or Nigel?
Yeah, I think Alice, we said the 21st, did we? Yeah. So I'm going to try and coerce officers into getting replies back to Alice by the 21st. So the 11th, I think, Alice, we'd said they were going to come out. Yeah.
Yeah. So the deadline for submitting your written questions as the panel is 10 a.m. on Monday, the 11th of December, and then they'll go to Nigel that day for getting responses, and then I hope to publish either late on the 21st of December once we've got those back, or on the 22nd of December.
Thank you. And have someone made a note to understand the basis for the modelling? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Certainly expect the car parks. Yeah, that's fine, Jim.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's good. Amir.
Yeah, thanks, James. Just a couple of questions. So I didn't realise that the written questions were by Monday, but I'll ensure that I get those in. They're coming to you, Alice, are they? By Monday. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
So just to check, I won't go through the detail, but I just want to get clarification on the efficiencies. At the beginning of the document, it talks about £17 million of efficiencies over the next few years, 4 years, I think it is. But in the breakdown, I could only see 2.38 million. And I'm assuming that's an annual level of efficiencies. And I just wanted to get clarification on that, either whether my maths is wrong or where that discrepancy might come from, please.
Yeah,
and then I had a process question. I'll follow up with afterwards. Thanks.
Yeah, I tried to describe the efficiencies, but in two terms. One is the total amount over the 4 or 5 year period. That's probably over a 5 year period. So if you added up all the efficiencies over that 5 year period, then you would get to that figure of 17 sort of thing. But then equally to sort of say in the final year, basically in 28, 29, yeah, there are ongoing additional efficiencies of X, yeah. So, that's just the annual amount. So there's the total amount over the period and then the annual amount ongoing from the end of the period. Does that make sense?
So it's £70 million in total across the 5 years, but
Correct.
that factors in the extra savings, presumably, that are in 28,
Correct.
29.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I'll go back and interrogate
Okay.
the numbers. Excellent. The other question was more around process. So just really just bearing in mind that we're going to be talking about Section 114 notices next. Obviously, it won't have passed members and officers by that the political makeup of the council has changed somewhat in recent times, and I just wanted to understand the implications of that, because obviously the Labour administration in the past has had quite a healthy majority, and so there has not necessarily been a requirement or a need to be maybe as collaborative as they otherwise might, although alongside Chris, I've also sat on this budget review group over the last couple of years, and I've always found it to be a reasonably collaborative exercise. But I guess my question was, given that there's no longer a Labour majority on the council, whether we're still confident as a finance panel, but also the confidence at the wider council level, and I guess that would be all the way right to the top with you, Nigel, that we might not have more disagreements this time round over where some of those savings come from, and some of these obviously are political decisions as to what services get cut and which don't, and levels of rent increases, for example, and so forth. So it was just to try and understand what's our contingency plan as a council for that possible eventuality. I know there's a second council meeting that normally gets penciled in after like a week or two later after the February one, the main council meeting, and then just from that, whether actually so obviously we'll all, I'm pretty sure, feedback to our individual groups from this finance panel, but whether there needs to be a separate process or a different process this year compared to previous years, because what we don't want to do is get to February and find that there are significant differences, which mean that the political choices as such aren't agreed upon. And that might lead to the unsavory position of not having a balanced budget. So just really around that, please.
Do you mind if I very quickly come in before you respond? Sorry,
yeah.
It's on the same time. Is we emailed about this, but it'd be good to say it in the room as well, is that I think a really useful thing for the opposition groups would be to see your professional opinion of what's on the table, essentially, of like, obviously what happens every year, or I hope it does, I don't see the insides of this process, is that there's a lot of different directions you can go in order to get towards the required balance, and the administration have taken their choices as to here are the particular efficiencies or cuts or savings or whatever, which we find more or less palatable compared to other ones, and that the responsible way for opposition to make a budget amendment in these circumstances is to look at that same question and say, are there different choices we'd wish to make in terms of which ones of these are more palatable than others? So basically, it's seeing the menu of options really is, I think, would be a really, really useful grounds on which to work. And then my feeling is that it's then up to the four of us as members of the opposition groups to sit down with each other and find out whether we have an agreement about any of those, because if we're all pulling in different directions, then well, there's nothing to be achieved. If we are in fact all pulling in the same direction, then we form a majority of the council, and we should collaborate to put together a constructive and balanced amendment that leads in that direction.
Can I just, before you come in, Nigel, I guess that last point you just made, Chris, was the one that I was most pertaining to, that if the opposition all agree on an alternative amendment, but that might lead to an unbalanced budget. That is, I guess, my concern.
I can solve that one for you by voting against any amendment that didn't have Nigel's stamp of approval.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions in there, James, and I think some of them are, you know, I can answer, and some of them I probably can't answer actually. I am aware that there are discussions going on, basically, because obviously there's a recognition of the change in the status of the council with the no overall control, and I'm aware there are discussions going on, basically, as to pick up some of the things that you've been talking about in terms of engagement with group leaders, basically, you know, before February, in order to discuss the budget, because as you've clearly highlighted, we don't want to get in the position in February where we are struggling to do that. I mean, I think I would be saying, as the council's chief financial officer, a couple of things, and I'm sure Emma Jackman would say a couple of things as well. And one is around, obviously, the requirement to set a balanced budget for the following financial year by the 15th of March of each year. That is a statutory requirement that all members are signed up to, and clearly there are legal implications should that not take place, actually. And I'm sure Emma will point that out, basically. I think the other point, the thing I would make is that, well, 2 points actually. One is that hopefully we will set a balanced budget on the 21st of February. If we don't, then we can track to the 28th of February, which is the reserve date that you mentioned, Chris. But if you do not set a balanced budget on the 28th of February, then I will not be in a position to issue the council tax bills. We will be too late. That will cause a lot of financial implications for the council. Indeed, there'll be charges levied from the county council. I'm pretty certain of that, and all sorts of implications, which I will point out to councillors, basically. So you have to set a budget. You have to legally set a 1-year budget, basically, but it is prudent and it is considered best practice by the council's external auditors and anybody else you talk to, of setting a medium-term financial plan, and to not do so again would be problematic. I looked at the number of authorities that have issued Section 114 notices, basically, and correlated that to the length of their financial plans. And hey presto, those that issued notices predominantly have 1-year plans, and you know, therein tells the tale, basically, that they are not planning ahead and not looking to the future. But those are all the things that we can talk about, I think. And as I say, there are discussions going on, I am aware, with Caroline Green and the leader about how we can make this process a bit slicker. Slicker is not the word, but how we can facilitate to get this budget over the line, because of the recognition, obviously, that we are in that no overall control, basically, and that changes the landscape a bit, actually. So I think I'll leave it there, actually, just say that all that you've said is recognised, and I think there'll be something coming out shortly about how that can best be facilitated. In terms of the things, I suppose, just finally, in terms of the things that the administration turned down. So yeah, in terms of the process, officers come forward and say, these are our proposals, these are our suggestions. Those suggestions, proposals are put to the Labour group, and they basically, through a system of scoring, basically they come up with things that they want to do and things that they don't want to do. With the papers I'll give you for the budget review group, I will give you all the proposals that were put forward to the Labour group, and you can quite clearly see the things that weren't accepted from looking at the budget report, and obviously the things that were accepted. And you can see for yourself what's been put on the table and what has been rejected, sort of thing. And you can see that as a group. And then that's open to all members. So the papers for this group are open to all members, and that is totally transparent to all groups, basically, to have a look at. So I think that's all I need to say at the moment, basically. But I think watch this space in terms of that more facilitation and more perhaps discussion, basically, in order to try and get this budget over the line, basically.
Thank you. I thought that was a very nice summary of the state of play. Amir.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. That was very considered thoughts and much appreciated. Just a couple of quick comments and then one question at the end, if I might. So one was your evaluation of the 1 year budgets versus councils that then issue a 114 notice, of course, may not be causation. It may be the other way around, that as your budget gets more tighter, that it becomes trickier to issue a 4 year budget, and that's why you therefore have to do a 1 year budget. But you know, we can hypothesize. The second question was just second comment, just that's really helpful that we'll get all the potential options that were on the table, just to make it. They're quite dense documents that come through, and I'm someone who likes numbers, but even I struggle. And it would be really helpful just when those recommendations come through to say these were all the recommendations on the table. If it could quite clearly just be highlighted, I don't know if it can be color coded or something like that, to say yes, these were accepted or these were declined, just to make it a little bit easier, because it's not just ourselves in this group that are going to have to read it and digest it, but we'll obviously share it with colleagues as well. And it is really quite appreciated that will come forward. I think that'll be excellent. Just my very final question, I just come back to the budget paper generally. You explained this to me a year ago, but you'll have to forgive me. My memory is not as good as it was when I was on the correct side of 40, whichever, well, I guess it depends what you deem to be the correct side of 40. In terms of a referendum, you'd mentioned to me last time that if I asked you last time, well, why not just go for a referendum, but make the cap go about, you know, the rise be above 3%. And I think you said to me there was a cost involved. And that potential cost may not be, maybe, you know, significantly larger, but I don't remember the details. And I wonder if you just jog my memory and share that with the other members as well, just so we can consider that in our comments.
Yeah. So the referendum would kick in where the authority wants to set a budget which goes above the referendum limits, and those limits have currently been set by the government as for this financial year, I would say 3% for district councils. The higher 3% or £5, whichever is the higher. So you trigger a referendum if you want to set a council tax which is higher than those limits. Actually, you have to set you do a shadow budget effectively, where you have to actually issue your council tax bills basically on the 15th of March as required under the law. You basically would issue those bills based on whatever council tax you are looking to set. So say you're looking to set a 10% council tax rise, you'd incorporate that into the council tax bills and you would issue those bills. You send them all out the door, and the referendum is held in May time. So you can tell straight away, basically, the problems that are going to happen here, basically, that you've got the referendum in May, and should you get that agreed, then all's well and good. If that is not agreed, basically, then effectively you've got to reverse all of those bills, basically, and calculate all the sort of work out all the accounting side of things, because you are expecting people to pay on those initial bills, and if they paid more than they are required to, because you've had to reduce the limit, the council tax down to the 3%, then that's going to be problems again. So invariably, you're going to end up rebilling, basically. And I think the costs that we've talked about previously are well in excess of 100,000, basically, to rebill for all of council tax and do the process again. That's the way the process works. I mean, I'm looking at Bill throwing under the bus, because that's certainly it's not an area we've got into, but that's certainly the process, isn't it, Bill?
Yeah, indeed it is. I mean, the other thing which you haven't mentioned is the actual cost of the referendum. That it's effectively like an election. You know, there would have to be polling clerks and presiding officers, etc., to actually administer the votes for people that can't that can't actually deal with things electronically, if we're allowed to do it electronically at all. So it's not something that I've been through, but from my experience when I've sort of advised on a similar sort of thing, I remember, this was a few years ago, that the costs look like they might be in the region of sort of 300,000 to 400,000. It was a similar sort of size authority. So, you know, what you've got to bear in mind is that then that is a cost that then comes off the amount of resources that the council's got available, and therefore invariably will lead to cuts going forward in the future in order to recoup those, because you can only spend it once, as it were. So yes, it's not a small matter. I think the other thing is as well, actually, there's in respect of actually going through the process of actually having to rebill, assuming that the referendum's lost, you've also got all of the customer services costs and potentially additional staff that you might have to get in to answer all of the queries.
Before taking Amir, I was going to add one point which I believe is correct from the past. I think there was a referendum somewhere in the West Country, but you have to, if I recall, get government approval for having such a referendum, central government. Anyhow, all I remember was it was said that they should give options. And I think one of the options was 0%, that someone came up with, of course, central government, 0% increase. And surprise, surprise, that's what people voted for. I just say that as a warning. I mean, that is why the upper limit that is the 3% is a pretty strict upper limit. Sorry,
yeah.
Amir.
And sorry, just sort of adding to that, I mean, the other thing is that there is actually very limited scope for the authority to actually say why the authority would want to raise above the referendum limit, because you're not allowed to spend any money effectively doing it. So you're kind of going out to referendum to the public without explaining why. You know, it might be very good reasons, like kind of dealing with the temporary accommodation issues, etc., which, you know, councillors fully support, but that's not able to then be communicated properly with the public. So that also causes issues around successful referendums, so to speak.
Thanks a lot.
Be careful what you wish for, I guess you're saying, James. Just two very quick clarifying questions, and then I'll let this rest. Just I think I'm right in reading in the papers and from memory that a 1% rise is about £150,000 extra income. Is that right? Okay. And then the second thing is, if it was to go to a referendum, because obviously, Bill, you're mentioning the cost of a referendum, but there'll be council elections this year, so presumably those could be, if there was to be one, I'm just hypothesizing, that could be incorporated into the city council election, so that the cost might be quite significantly less than you otherwise might anticipate.
Yes, agreed. Yes, it could be accommodated alongside.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've probably had enough discussion. I mean, the only comment I was going to make, and I'm clearly not in cabinet, I'm not in a position to speak for the group I still belong to. I mean, within the group, as you will see from what Nigel's going to share with you, and some of you must surely have seen it before, is there's horse trading. There are options, and people give their preferences within groups, and they don't all agree. So there's horse trading. But then when it comes to the actual budget debate, there are discussions in the course of the council meeting between group leaders and all the rest about agreeing on possible changes. So conceptually, I don't see this as wildly different from what has happened before. The big constraint is we need Nigel to be able to sign off on whatever's proposed as being a balanced budget. And that is a big constraint. So I'm sure things can be changed, but that's always hanging over you as the ultimate constraint. And I think that's a good discipline. I mean, that's just a personal view. But don't forget comments, questions for the various budget review group meetings. That's very important because that will influence the ultimate proposed budget quite separately from any discussions between groups and group leaders.
James,
And
just
I
on
should
that, if
say,
you don't mind, can we just clarify the dates? I don't have them all. Is it possible to get those clarified? I didn't see them in...
Alice sent out invitations.
Do you want me to just clarify them now?
Would that be okay? Just because I don't have them easy to find.
So it's the 3rd, 4th, 9th and 15th of January, all at 6 p.m. start via Zoom.
Excellent, thank you. And is the 15th the one where we, if I remember correctly from previous years, we put forward the recommendations and then the 15th is the one that we sign off, or is that the one that's on the 20-something of January?
So on the 15th, the Budget Review Group will consider its final report, and then there's a Finance and Performance panel on the 22nd of January where that will consider the report, and then it will go to scrutiny in February for final sort of endorsement.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hosnia.
I guess this is also a process question, really. Why is it that basically my work schedule at the hospital is quite difficult, because most of my operating lists in the cancer theatre basically run for 12 hours. So though I can try my best, etc., to move things around and finish we start at 7 a.m. because often we're delayed sending for patients because of nursing shortages. We are starting late more and more, which means that I can't always guarantee 6 o'clock is difficult sometimes. So I just wondered, obviously I'm looking ahead, trying to make changes as I can, swap with colleagues, etc. But I did wonder why substitutions are not permitted on this group, because that would, obviously I don't want a situation whereby our group can't contribute to this very important process. But I just wondered why it's the issue of not allowing substitutions for this.
Alice will answer.
Yeah, thank you. So the issue of substitutions is purely the decision taken in the scrutiny operating principles, which the scrutiny committee agrees at the start of each year. If there were to be any deviation from that that's already been agreed, that would need to be taken through scrutiny committee, which obviously doesn't meet until mid-January at this point. So that would be quite difficult to get any sort of leeway on that step. But that is the reason why there's no substitutions.
I just wondered if any exceptions could be made. It's because basically our operating lists are more and more with the nursing shortages starting. We're waiting to send for patients in the morning. I get there at 7:30. We do a team hug at 8, and often we're told not to send for patients because there are no nurses, because Oxford housing costs are so high. So it's all kind of related. But it would be, so there is no way of, at this point, changing that, because there is no scrutiny committee meeting. Is there any way of doing that via the scrutiny committee members without the next meeting? Just because I think I will try my best, but it is a bit of an issue. It's not within my power. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not something I can change. It's just something that happens now in the NHS quite a lot.
I can certainly take that away and have a look at what can be done, but I can't make any promises at this stage. And obviously there's the danger of setting a precedent for other members as well. I appreciate that,
but it is for those of us who are working longer hours, which a lot of people do shift work. It is a real issue, the timings of meetings, and I do take duty leave where I can, but obviously that needs to be reserved for council meetings.
Chris Jarvis.
So yeah, just thinking aloud a little bit, but I know that in previous years, before Chris Smoton joined the Finance Panel and Budget Review Group, I believe he attended a lot of the Budget Review Group meetings as an observer, and I wonder whether that might be a workaround in future.
Well, the observer attends, but they're not part of the discussion. That's the problem.
I can take that away and have a look into it and report back if that's acceptable.
I think that's the best you can do. Thanks very much. Thanks for raising it, Osnia. And the other trouble is, if we start later, which I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, then we have issues of officers and officer time and other family commitments by other people. I think this is one of the difficulties of being a city councillor and being an active one. But I'll let Alice discuss it, maybe with Emma from Legal Services, to see what can be done. Thanks. And maybe Chris Jarvis has suggested a possible kind of way of getting around it. I had earlier been going to say to Bill and Paul, your agenda item has come and gone, and I didn't say thank you and you're welcome to go. But as it turned out, we called on you, Bill, so you're very welcome to go. But equally, if you want to stay, we may call on you again.
I might well be needed for the confidential item, Councillor.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, Amir, a hand appeared and vanished.
I was just going to make Bill's point that I think the confidential papers, Bill may want to stay for that bit.
Okay, we'll try and be quick going through the rest, but these are all important. Let's go on, and I thank Nigel very much for getting the paper ready for the Section 114 comparison. But what's the situation on that? That was very helpful. And I think there's at least one since you completed your paper.
Nottingham.
Yeah.
Yeah, again. Yeah. Do you want me to give a short intro?
Please, can you introduce it?
Yeah, no worries.
It's a good paper, thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I want to give credit to Alice, basically, who did a lot of the research on this, and thanks for Alice to put in all the Appendix A issues together, actually. And probably give me a bit of a G along to say, we can do this. So thanks, Alice, and I'll say put that in the minutes, Alice. Thank you. Yeah. So contrary to popular belief, this wasn't me issuing a Section 114 notice, and I have to be very careful on the heading that I gave when I circulated this report around. Lest I start the hairs running, basically. That's Nigel's issued a Section 114, but I haven't done that. So this is as requested by the chair, really to sort of give some balance as to where we are in the sort of context of how close are we to issuing a Section 114 when so many authorities are doing that. So the paper sort of sets out what a Section 114 notice is. Under Section 114 of the Local Government Finance Act 1988. It's basically a notice issued by my good self to the council, where the authority are in danger of not fulfilling their legal requirement of setting a balanced budget, or indeed are looking to incur expenditure which is unlawful. And there are certain requirements. There's a set process which it's basically issued to the council, and the council have 21 days to respond to that notice. And normally that's in the form of you must stop all non-essential spend and any spend that is not to do with sort of assisting vulnerable individuals or the like. Actually, it's known as in the field as a bankruptcy notice, but in essence, no authority can actually go bankrupt, basically, but that's what it's known as. And many authorities have done that, have been labelled with that as going bankrupt, like the Birminghams of this world, actually. So the first few paragraphs just explain what that is. Obviously, this is in the role of a chief financial officer, this is one of the most critical points of a career, and it could be very career defining, and in some cases make careers short-lived, basically. And therefore, it's something which can't be taken lightly, because it will have a long-lasting impact on the authority, actually. It's done in conjunction with me, in conjunction with or consultation with the monitoring officer and the chief executive. And it's really a last resort when all other things have failed. It is a last resort, basically. And as I say, we'll come on to a sec. Hopefully, I'm not going to be doing that anytime soon. In terms of paragraph 14, and onwards. There's a notable in local authorities that have issued Section 114s over the period. They're mainly top tier 1 authorities, but there's quite a number of tier 2 authorities now making noises that they will be issuing Section 114s. Hastings, Stoke-on-Trent, Southampton, Guildford, and the like, actually. And as I said earlier, there was something in one of the government presses announcements today, which said that 1 in 5 local authorities have said, or chief financial officers this is, have said that they will be issuing Section 114s in the coming months, years, basically. And at least 90% of top tier 1 authorities will be issuing those reports. 90% basically will be issuing those reports in the coming months, actually. That's just where we are basically as a sector. We have significant problems, and like I said earlier, the sort of temporary accommodation problem to us is the adult social services and children's services to a county council. I did something that through the analysis in Appendix A, you can sort of pick out some of the reasons for failures, and they're listed in paragraph 20. Poor and lack of financial control, poor governance, complex company arrangements, and so on and so forth. And I've tried to sort of pitch the report in comparison of the Oxford City Council to those particular issues that arose in those authorities. So just in terms of themes, in terms of financial management and control, and again, it's a judgment call, but we've first and not least, basically, we have been able to set a medium-term financial plan where most authorities struggle to set 1 year, basically, but we can do that for 4 years. We haven't had those major significant variances, certainly on revenue, and those we have had, there've been some over the COVID period, actually, but that's understandable. But generally, we've been, thereabouts on revenue. On capital, if anything, we slip, and we're on the right side, if you like, rather than overspending. But not that from an accountability viewpoint, that's a great place to be. But nevertheless, from a financial angle, basically, it's certainly not going to cause us any problems in that respect. We talk about the internal audits, and they give us have done for the last few years, a moderate assurance. That is one below the highest level, basically, and it's one that 90% of authorities get. So where it's moderate doesn't sound that good. It is good in the eyes of the internal auditors, actually. In terms of our companies, we've got quite, I would say, relatively good controls over our companies. We have a structure, obviously, with the shareholder groups that monitor those companies on a regular basis, and oversight of what they are up to on a day-to-day basis. Could we do more? Probably, actually. And we've had several reviews, and I've no doubt Emma Jackman will be picking up and doing further reviews in this area to tighten up where, again, she has some oversight to tighten things up on. In terms of charging revenue, capital to revenue to capital, and vice versa, this is an area which a number of authorities foul of, basically, where they charge capital revenue expenditure to capital, basically. The auditor takes a real dim view of that, actually, and in their terms of reference, they actually class it as fraud. Whether I would go as far as that, basically, I don't know, but that's how much they take that view. If you start capitalizing revenue items in accountancy, we have a look at that. We oversee that on a regular basis, and we try to shut that down where we find it, and have a strong word with anybody that tries to do that, basically, to make them aware of their actions, basically, because they could be potentially serious on the authority, resulting in qualification of our accounts and so on and so forth. Charging to the HRA is another area, basically, which the likes of Nottingham have been hauled over the coals on. There are professional judgments, because you're dealing with salaries and wages and support service costs, and you've got to take a judgment basically on how much work is being done on HRA as opposed to general fund. But I'm generally satisfied that that judgment is sound, and I don't think we are anywhere near a Nottingham City Council state of affairs, actually. In terms of borrowing and lending, we try and keep a real tight hold of that, actually. We have significant lending to the housing company for development. And that's obviously, I think whenever you are doing development, then you have got risk. There is no doubt about that. It's just how much can you actually mitigate that risk? And we use, you've heard before talk about covenants like the interest cover ratio, for instance, where it restricts the amount of activity that both the HRA and the company can do. You know, it's similar to Barclays Bank saying, well, you must have an interest cover ratio of X basically, and if you haven't, then I might well be looking to call the loans in anytime soon. So it's trying to operate like a bank in terms of that lending basically, and it's trying to mitigate any sort of risk. But as I say, it's development at the end of the day, and if you're going to do development, then I think you've got to accept a level of risk actually in that activity. Minimum revenue provision, I won't give you a masterclass on that, probably because I couldn't, but I got Bill here if you need one. But minimum revenue provision is an area again which some authorities fell over on. There are all sorts of practices going on which obviated the need to charge any minimum revenue provision to the revenue accounts, and clearly they've been found out basically. Again, we're quite rigorous in terms of what we do. We apply MRP where we believe we need to, and if we don't, then we don't. But again, I'm happy with the process that we've got. Risk associated with external audit of the accounts. You'll hear me say before that that's a bit of a problem here at the moment. We haven't got 21-2 accounts signed off. We haven't got 22-3 accounts signed off, and we're about to go into 23-4 final accounts. So as we get further and further behind, that is a problem basically. But equally, there are authorities that haven't even got 2015 accounts signed off actually. I'm sure we will get there. QL set us back a long way, and I suppose the things like QL illustrated the vulnerability of the council. When we're trying to work in the financial field, basically, when we haven't got information on what our companies are doing, and we haven't got information on the impact on the client accounts. And again, it just demonstrates the vulnerabilities of this.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about reserves as well. And finally, equal pay. I mentioned equal pay because obviously Birmingham, that was a main issue around Birmingham. I don't think any authority is far away from an equal pay claim. And I'm not going to sit here and say that we haven't got equal pay claims against the council, because we have. But we are defending those. We are not on the scale of a Birmingham City, basically, nowhere near it. But I'm not going to sit here and say that we've got them, basically, because we are actively defending some of these as we speak, actually. And then just in terms of summary, I mean, am I going to issue a Section 114 report anytime soon? No, I'm not, basically. I don't think I will be in that position. But you have to take the right decisions. And I suppose I align this to the budget setting process and making sure that you have a balanced budget. And I would argue making sure that you maintain that 4-year balanced plan, and if you take those right decisions, then I won't be in a state to issue a notice. But it is about doing that and doing the right thing, as I say. But happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was again very nice and comprehensive, and it's much appreciated. Any questions? I thought this was largely just for our information, but I'll take the two Chris's. Chris Merton was just ahead of Chris Jarvis in putting his hand up. There we are. Go on, Chris.
Two questions from me. One of which is, when it comes to capitalization, where does the line lie when it comes to repair and renovation? Like, I feel like I'm pretty clear that if you have a sort of an annually recurring cost of keeping something in order, then that's not. And that if you're sort of buying something outright one time, that clearly is a capital expense. But what do we usually say about things where we're sort of aware we're going to need to rebuy at some frequency, but it isn't an annual cost? And then secondly, how does internal borrowing figure into all of this? Like, when we borrow internally, presumably the cost that that incurs to us in sort of in actual cash in the bank terms is that that's no longer reserves that we can have in some investment accruing some yields for us, and now it's in use. How did the cost of that materialize? What row of the budget does that show up on, and how do we need to account for that?
See, this is why I kept Bill on the call, actually.
Yeah,
Over to you, Bill.
I thought these were going to be thrown at me. Okay, so in terms of capital expenditure, it's always a bit of a grey area and a bit of a professional judgment. But where you're talking about major items, such as, say, on the HRA, new kitchens, etc., you would capitalise those because they have a long-term benefit to the asset. And indeed, the government, when they originally set out what their major repairs allowance was within the housing subsidy regime, as was, that they included those sorts of items within the major repairs allowance, which was a capital fund. So that side of things, where you've got something really big, like, as I say, kitchen replacement, new bathroom, it adds to the utility of the asset, and therefore you can capitalize it over a number of years. One of the things that we do as a accounting methodology is we componentize, so major elements of assets are depreciated to revenue account on different periods, so it's sort of essentially over the life of the asset. Where you've got, if you say you've just got to replace a basin because somebody's cracked it, that would be a revenue item because it's not actually in the kind of the kind of planned major repairs program. So it's really what we do is we make sure that those sorts of things we split up accordingly. I hope that's answered that question. Sorry, could you remind me what the second question was?
Internal borrowing and how the costs of
thank you.
internal borrowing show up in our accounts.
Yeah, so internal borrowing effectively is from cash resources. What it means is we're not actually borrowing. What we're doing is we're using internal cash resources to finance capital. When we use internal borrowing, one of the costs that's still the same is what has actually been touched upon is the MRP, the minimum revenue provision. So what we do is we charge the cost of that borrowing, whether it's internal or external, to the revenue account over the life of whatever asset's being financed. So internal borrowing, in that respect, the principal will appear in that line within the Treasury management budgets. The other aspect will be actually on the investment income. So as you're using more money, you have less money in your bank account effectively, and so less to invest, less interest coming in. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing depends on the relative amounts of interest that you get from investments compared to the amount you actually have to pay out on borrowing. Generally speaking, borrowing rates are higher. So therefore, internal borrowing is preferable from an overall financial perspective to borrowing externally. And there's one of the things that we do within the Treasury management field is actually monitor that side of things. How much we've got in cash, how much we're predicting, what our capital expenditure is going to be over the forthcoming years, but also within there's a cash flow need as well, because you've got major items of expenditure like payment of precepts, which don't go through the revenue, but they actually hit our bank account. So what we have to do is make sure we have enough cash surplus to cover that. So that will always be sitting there as a level of temporary investments, as it were. But the council policy is to use as much internal borrowing as possible within those constraints in order to actually keep the overall costs of the council down. So in short, it all appears on the sort of treasury management figures within minimum revenue provision and the investment interest.
Thank you. The other Chris, Jarvis.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, but first just want to say thanks for the paper, which I found incredibly helpful. Really the laying out line by line the areas of risk I found yes, very helpful in terms of getting an overview and understanding of what's going on elsewhere. My first question really though is around something which appeared to be, I think, possibly an omission in terms of the narrative of what's been going on elsewhere, and this relates to commercial property. And my understanding was that at least some of the councils that have had to issue Section 114 notices, part of the underlying problems they've had has been overexposure to commercial property investments. I don't think I'm wrong in saying that Croydon is one such council that they had a high level of risk associated with commercial property investments. And obviously, given the nature of our income streams, I wondered if it would be possible to get some comment on how our level of risk relates to other councils that have had to go down that route. And the second question was around the issue of equal pay. So I guess the question really is that, I mean, the Birmingham City Council example obviously is a very recent one, and the scale of that equal pay claim was obviously huge. But I guess my understanding is that Birmingham City Council have known about the equal pay claim for a very, very long time. I feel like I still lived in Birmingham and was probably still at school in Birmingham when that when the equal pay claim was first made. I feel like surely, you know, from our perspective in terms of as a council, we would be well aware if there was anything anywhere near on that scale of issues regarding equal pay. And clearly a series of things have gone wrong at Birmingham where, you know, that case well over a decade in the making, there weren't sufficient mitigations put in place for it going the way that the council didn't want it to go. There is a question there somewhere. Hopefully you've been able to decipher it. But yeah.
Well, I'm going to invite Bill first to respond.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on a couple of things around investment properties. That although it's not explicit in the report as a separate item, a couple of areas that actually that actually it impacts is on the minimum revenue provision, because when a lot of authorities did their assessment of whether a commercial investment was worthwhile, what they did was they used one of the aspects of the government guidance, which allows for minimum revenue provision to be charged in line with depreciation. So through accounting rules, investment properties don't get depreciated. So what they did was they said, well, in that case, we're going to buy these investment properties and we don't need to make a minimum revenue provision. Then when the government kind of comes and clamps down on that and their external auditors start raising the flag, they then have a minimum revenue provision they have got to make on the purchases that they've made, not only for their current year, but also for previous years. That also links in with the amount that they've taken out for purchasing these commercial properties through borrowing. That the revenue amounts don't actually cover the costs which they're incurring overall. I hope that kind of helps with a bit of that. Nigel might want to come in on other matters.
Yeah, on top of page 13, so I talk about properties in terms of the Odeon I talk about the partnership with Nuffield, etc. And I suppose that was my way of picking up the Croydon sort of point. Croydon's was around a hotel, I believe, actually, or one of the issues Croydon foul was around a hotel, and also an energy company as well. I'm making the point. I think I make the point that when you're involved in development, whether it's with your own housing company, which ours is, or whether we are looking to build out and do regeneration, such as the Odeon, if you've got development, that you are going to run some risk. If you don't want to do that development, then we won't. We will take the projected income out of the budget, and we'll have to make cuts elsewhere. And that's not trying to be emotive. That's just that's where we are basically. We've tried really hard to get our investment property income back to a level of pre-COVID, and it is just about getting there, plus a little bit on top as well. Actually, our rents went downwards after COVID, and you listen to Jane Winfield, she said we were probably over rented anyway. In other words, our rents were too high for the properties that we were renting, and the base rents have fallen. But we've managed to sort of push them back up again by introducing schemes like George Street, Cadogan House, Odeon, to actually generate more rent and push the overall rent, commercial property rent, back upwards. But like I say, certainly in respect to the developments like Oxpens, Oxwed, our own wholly owned company, and obviously the Odeon that we've recently agreed, you are going to get risk in those. But I think, I would rely on the professionalism of our property teams, actually, that has got some really decent firepower in that team to actually mitigate the risk, or at least some of the risks that are ever present when you undertake development. Just moving forward onto the equal pay, yeah, I think you're right in terms of I suppose the risk in Birmingham just grew out of proportion, that there was no authority in the country that's going to be able to cover that off, not even the Birminghams of this world, basically. I would state well, I don't say it, but I do not think that we've got anything like that. I am talking about claims. We have claims where somebody feels aggrieved, basically, that their colleague is being paid more than them, and they are doing the same job. That's the perception. And those are the type of claims that I'm talking about. And as I say, I'm not going to sit here and say we haven't got claims, because we have. We just haven't got anywhere near the scale of claims that Birmingham. I'm talking off the top of my head, are probably less than a handful, basically. But they're nevertheless claims. And as I say, I don't think any authority are that far away. If they've got a sizable amount of workforce, as we have, you're never far away from a claim, basically.
Thank you very much. I just have one simple question, if I may, which is, I'm not sure whether it's for Bill or you, Nigel. How we treat capitalization of expenditures, which was the first question asked. Ultimately, the external auditor has to sign off on our accounts. I know they're not the fastest kids off the block, but presumably someone somewhere has approved our treatment of this. It'll be particularly important for HRA, but is it something that they have signed off on?
Sorry, Bill, just before you come in there, Alice, is it possible to let my other user get in? I've just about to lose power on this laptop.
Yeah, sorry, I thought Alice would have seen the chat, which was 2 minutes ago.
Yeah. Bill, do you want to take that, or?
Yes.
Yeah, so... Oh, brain's gone. Sorry.
This is about
the auditors signed off.
Have the auditors signed off? Yeah. Sorry, I had my answer exactly ready, and then my brain just went froze. Yeah, no, the external auditors haven't signed off on our capital expenditure, except for years where they have fully signed off, if you see what I mean. So the open years, no, they haven't said that everything is okay. But what we do internally is that management accountants go through the schemes that are in their particular area and sift those through. And then my team have a really close look at it. And anything that's in the capital programme has to end up on an asset, or in the case of where we've got renovation grants, etc., it goes through the revenue account, but that's kind of an accounting matter. And if there's anything there that doesn't look like it actually adds to an asset, then we will reverse it to revenue. So yeah, we have kind of two gatekeepers, as it were, the management accountants and then the financial accountants who come along and do a review of it.
We have our own internal policing, if you like, James, and obviously the external policing.
No, that's good. It's nice and reassuring. I'm just thinking, we've still got other things to do. In terms of any recommendations or whatever, do we have any? I feel this was largely for us to be educated, and you've educated us further in this discussion, for which very many thanks. And I hope people elsewhere will read this and understand better the state of local government finance right now and the challenges. Chris?
I don't want to make anything too onerous, but I wondered whether, given the current financial situation that councils are facing across the country, and it's unlikely the list of councils issuing Section 114 notices isn't going to increase in the next 12 months, 24 months, etc., whether it might be useful for there to be a kind of possibly annual update on the sector and the issues that councils are facing and how we're mitigating against those risks. I would find that incredibly useful, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Is that accepted? If within you and your team, Nigel, if you can update it, because I fear it is a moving target.
Yeah.
Anyhow, thanks again very much indeed. Let's now, Jason's been incredibly patient. If we can now come to the question we posed at our last meeting about the trade-off between acquisition and leasing of these properties and the HRA. Would you like to introduce your paper?
Yeah, certainly. So with regards to the HRA, with regards to the council, any sort of rented dwelling that we hold has to be held within the HRA. The exception to that is that temporary accommodation. We can buy temporary accommodation using general fund resources, and that can be held in the general fund, and any income generated from it goes to the general fund. But yeah, so there's two options. We can buy it from the general fund, or we can buy it from the HRA. The third option is that we can lease it. But if we lease a property, we can't hold it within the HRA. So that has to be done through the general fund. So there's various financial implications to each of those options. But for the purposes of the temporary accommodation mitigations that we're looking at the moment, we're looking at doing some options appraisals on each one of those options. And you know, if we do go down a particular route, it will be a mixture of acquisitions and private sector leases, because at the moment there's properties in Oxford are quite hard to come by, especially the types that we need for this. It takes a long time to buy them. We've got budget limitations. There's the high sales value of them as well. And then also, if we buy a property and we no longer need it, we've then got to think about disposing of it. So, you know, leasing can be quicker. We can lease a property, and then once we've finished with it and there's no longer a demand for it, we can terminate that lease quite quickly. The problem we've got at the moment is that we're having a couple of planning consents issue because of the required change of use. So that's, I mean, in a nutshell, that's very brief, very quick, but if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think Hosnia's signed off. I'm sorry to see she doesn't feel well, but thanks for attending if she's still there. I suppose what I wonder is, everything we've heard suggests that we're going to have pressure for temporary accommodation. It's not going to be a declining demand. It's only going to grow. And I cannot imagine, even if houses are expensive in Oxford, that it's necessarily any cheaper to go out and get privately leased, rented properties. So I suppose I have two questions. One is, I don't know how long the leases are. I mean, what are your choices out there? But is there a simple, I understand these are coming from different pockets, but what is the cost benefit of, let's say, assuming current rents, current leases, current property acquisitions continue to be valid, assuming there's always demand? Will you be able to give us ever a nice, simple summary of the cost benefit of the different options? Because you imply you're looking at all of them, and some I suspect is just because of flexibility. But I just wonder, in an ideal world where you could buy a property immediately, which is the best option in your view, given that it'll be general fund, which is the best option for us?
Well, the best option would always be to buy the property, because you then got the value of the property at disposal. So that would be the best option. But as I say, with the time it takes to buy a property, the lack of availability of suitable properties, that isn't so much of a readily available option. And that's why we're looking at a mixture of different types of ownership and leasing.
Because you have no choice. But how long are the leases then that you sign up to?
Well, the leases can vary. We can have very short-term leases of 6 months or a year, you know, and we can have longer term, but there's more risk associated with longer term leases, obviously.
Yeah. I just wonder, I mean, should there be, I suppose this is a question in part for Nigel, I mean, should we have a strategy of, within all the constraints of our budget and capital versus current and all the rest, should we be aiming to maximize the properties we're going out to purchase, even if Oxford is a very expensive place, the properties that we purchase in order to meet this need? Because the bottom line is that it's better for us financially. I mean, that's the question. Should we be having such a strategy, or maybe we do implicitly?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's difficult because if you're going to buy the property, you're still got to have the money available to actually do it. So you've got to have that, you've got to have the capital funding to do that actually. So, and therein lies the rub. So Jason's right, from a financial viewpoint, then purchasing is better. But if you haven't got the resources, then your only other options are potentially leasing, sort of things, switch to leasing. Have we got a strategy? I wouldn't say we've got an overt strategy in particular, but we treat each case on its own merits. And certainly, you know, though both those considerations, I'm sure will be there when we're looking at the properties that we require for mitigating our costs of temporary accommodation.
I mean, maybe we don't need to discuss it now. I just wonder whether there isn't in the background a strategy. At least this is an investment where we agree we'll need temporary accommodation, sadly, for a long time to come. This seems to be a case where there is an investment case for doing it and to save on accommodation because there's a tangible benefit compared with the only alternatives open to us. As long as you believe we always need temporary accommodation. So I just wonder what the real constraint would be on seeing this as a valid investment, which is paying for itself in terms of opportunity cost.
Yeah, as I say, we will look at all of those areas, and that would include purchasing as well as leasing. Actually, I mean, in terms of purchasing for TA, not my field, but I mean, clearly, I think the housing service, like property that can be broken into multiple lets. So big properties that can house more than 10 families, basically, homeless families. If you buy individual properties across the city, management of all that basically becomes more difficult, sort of thing. So all I would say is that in the project that's looking at the mitigations for temporary accommodation, I think all those areas will be looked at, including purchasing, basically. But we just haven't got. I don't think we've got one overarching sort of strategy for that, basically. But it will certainly be looked at in that project.
But you seem, I suppose, final point, maybe it's a request, a recommendation. I would just like to see it laid out, assuming, which I think we all accept, that we will always need more properties for temporary accommodation. I would just like to know whether, rather than do it project by project, which is how you both seem to be describing it, because there's always a need, whether there could be some clearer strategy in terms of the balance as between looking out for purchasing versus the other options.
Well, we can look at that. I mean, I think in terms of the need, I mean, whilst the need is there now, there was a point, basically, I'm going back a few years back, when we had properties that we purchased in Didcot, basically, and some in Bicester, when I remember having the conversations with Neris, say they're empty. You've got properties and they're staying empty. What the hell are you doing, basically? Because that's costing me money. And we were even contemplating selling those properties and generating the capital receipt. How times have changed, basically. But I'm just saying, yes, there is an absolute need now, James. You're absolutely right. But things do change. And I say that was a position about 2 or 3 years ago that I was having those conversations with Neris.
Okay. Jason, did you want to chip in, and then we can let you go?
Yeah, it's about getting the right size property as well. And I think the properties that Nigel's referring to, they weren't quite the right size for the temporary accommodation we needed at the time. So
okay. All right. Well, thanks very much. I don't know whether, in the light of this, Alice would like to note anything that's in the way of a recommendation. You gather that was the question that drove me when I suggested we have this item on the agenda. And I would just like, and I think the people on this call also like, numbers, just to get some sense of the cost benefit from the different options. And the best we can do is to look at it as the situation is today. And maybe in the light of what you just said, Jason, it's almost consider different kinds, no, not hundreds, but different kinds of households in terms of maybe how the cost benefit would differ according to meeting their housing needs. But because it's an important question, it's not going to get less important, I fear. If that's possible, I would be very grateful. Thank you. Anything else from the panel? Because of the group, I think we should then thank you very much, Jason, and go on to scrutiny performance monitoring. So now who am I going to, I think I'm going to ask can I ask you, Alice, to introduce this, since you're the person who has done most to try and make sense of this?
Yeah, so the latest KPI information on the KPIs that the panel has agreed to continue monitoring until such a point as there are new KPIs are included in the agenda pack. There's also some written responses from the written questions that were submitted last time, which are there for noting. The panel's just asked to agree any written questions it wishes to submit to officers for response at the next panel meeting. I think that's all from me, really.
Well, that's very good. Are there then any questions out there before you're ground down by so many different items to consider. And by the way, we are awaiting for next financial year responses from the relevant officers about improving, fine-tuning the KPIs. You know, there were queries about quite a lot, and some we felt were redundant and the like, and some were not quantifiable. But are there any specific questions on this list? Anybody? If not, I just wonder, I think it might be, I'm looking at two specific KPI performance indicators. One was about, it's called CS003, which was, it's about restrictions on staffing and very long waits. This was, I think, responses to calls and everything. I just wonder, do we know, was this essentially due to the errors on the single person discount? I'm assuming that was the reason. I don't know if we know the answer. And then there's CS002, the time to process changes in circumstances. We are told about the migration from Capita to Civica, and I just wonder, have things now bedded down and it's all hunky-dory again? Or is there some other reason why this has been an issue in this latest batch of KPIs? That was it. I don't know. I don't expect, or maybe you can give us the answers, Alice.
So in relation to CS003, I did ask officers, and they said they can't quantify exactly that the higher call volumes were because of the letters. But their council tax call rate did increase, and they received 4,878 calls on the council tax line compared to 3,583 last September, which is an increase of 1,295 calls.
Very precise, thank you. And on the other one, I guess that's more for people working with IT somewhere to tell us whether the switchover was the problem and has it bedded down now.
I think it's probably my area, James, and
okay.
I think the answer to your question is yes. It largely related to the switchover. It resulted in quite a few backlogs of claims processing. Having said that, given the amount of work that we've done on robotic process automation, we are now processing claims within the month, and we are virtually up to date with all our claims. So I think, testament to the team basically of doing a hell of a job basically, and we've automated a lot of the processes, which has now improved these indicators quite considerably. But certainly at this point in time, we were still addressing the backlog of work.
Thank you for that clarification. I mean, what I would suggest, given the lateness of the hour and everything else, if you have specific comments on certain of the KPIs, please submit them via Alice, and bear in mind that we are promised a revised set which we will be able to comment on, which I hope meets some of the criticisms we've had in the past. Is that fair? I think that's fair comment, isn't it, Nigel and Alice? Yeah. Thank you ever so much. Okay. Well, let's note the dates of future meetings, because then we can go into confidential session at last on the exempt treasury management matters.